Hello, everyone. I'm Hsieh, the director of the Asia Global Institute. I haven't seen so many people in this room for a long time. I guess it's a speaker, is the topic of today's discussion, which is about the future of China. The title, Where is China Going? Is in everyone's mind here. Given we're all in Hong Kong, I don't need to give any long introduction about why we are concerned about the future of China. Right? There have been quite a lot of changes in policies. There has been quite a lot of policy uncertainty. And today's Chinese government policies and regulatory framework over the economy are obviously quite different from what it was, let's say 15 or maybe 20 years ago. Our speaker, Professor Hsieh from University of Chicago Business School, is a famous macroeconomist studying development issues as well as productivity growth in many different countries. When I was a grad student, I started reading his wonderful papers about the East Asian tigers, which we all know, how Singapore and Hong Kong used to be very similar in terms of their growth path, and they started to diverge around 15 years ago as well. We are not going to spend time talking about Hong Kong, but obviously you can ask him questions about that. He's going to spend around 40 minutes going through some PPT he has, trying to shed light about how we can use this framework to understand today's China as well as the future China's economic growth path. But moreover, I look forward to the interaction with you, based on your past research as well as your current work on China. Hsieh is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science as well as a fellow of Econometric Society. If you are fellows of these two organizations, the probability that you will win the Nobel Prize is higher than 50%. Let me stop here and turn the stage to Hsieh.
The slides here? There we go. Okay. All right. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. So what I want to do here is that I want to try to make sense of what I've been seeing with my eyes in the last 15 years, try to make sense of, let me just pick up on one thing that Hsieh said, of the contradictions, and then try to make sense of what is driving these contradictions, and then what that implies for what likely to see in the future. So the way I thought I would start is, here, I'm just going to try to do this, is I'm going to start by giving you what I would say is sort of the dominant view about China in the United States. And there's a dominant view now that the way to think about China is that it's really the end of this golden era of China, that this is really the end of what the Chinese call the end of reform and opening up. I don't need to remind you of the facts that have been behind this, but I would say it slowly started to happen. So we first started to see signs of this in 2018 with what happened in 2018 was the first set of crackdowns. So that's when you start to see the crackdown on the Wanda Group, you start to see the crackdown on the Tomorrow Group, lots of companies like that. So I don't need to give you details. And then the thing that people found really shocking was what started to happen in 2020. 2020, where the crackdown on Ali, and then it's not just Ali, but the crackdown on Didi, the crackdown on Mei Tuan, the closing of the online education companies, and these are just some examples. So it's something that I'm sure everybody in this room knows well. Right? Which is, why would you, if what you want to do is reform and opening up, why would you be cracking down on some of your most entrepreneurial firms? Why would you be cracking down on your $500 billion, your company's worth $500 billion companies? Why would you crack down? There was a period before the crackdown when people, I don't know how seriously people took it here, but people in the U.S. were talking seriously about how, that Ali was maybe going to their money payment system was going to be the new currency of the world. People were really thinking that this is a very realistic possibility. And so the inference that people have drawn is that there has been just a big change. There's been a big change. So I'll just give you some of the very typical headlines that one sees in American newspapers. So one, in the Wall Street Journal, it says Xi Jinping aims to rein in Chinese capitalism, hew to Mao's socialist vision. The other one that I hear a lot all the time is China uninvestable. So I would say that's I think is the dominant view in the U.S. now. I mean, whether it's right or wrong, that's a separate question. But that's what people believe. What I also want to tell you is there's also another set of facts that I suspect is well known to people here, but it's totally unknown to people outside of China. But I think they're just as important. And I'll just describe to you what I've also been seeing at the same time. And I would say that what I've seen is also just a gradual rollout, starting in about 2014, of just much better institutions for private firms. So maybe the way I'm going to illustrate the story is there's this really funny incident, I don't know how many of you are aware of, that the World Bank has been doing this thing called the Doing Business surveys. So it's essentially this detailed survey of business practices, and they've been doing this in all the countries of the world. China has traditionally done poorly in these surveys, and the story goes that in 2012, the premier at the time, Wen Jiabao, found out about this, and he was both upset and puzzled. So I think the numbers were that China ranked at about 160 out of 180 countries in the world in the World Bank doing business indicators. And the story goes, and I think this is, don't ask me for how I know this, but I think it's pretty accurate. He gave instructions to the World Bank's directors at the World Bank to kill the project. So the World Bank responded like any good bureaucracy does. It put together a committee to look at the business indicators. This was a committee. You can look at the report on the web. They appointed the finance minister of South Africa to be the head of the committee. They discussed it for a year, and they came up with some suggested changes to the World Bank Doing Business Indicators methodology to deal with the problems that the Chinese authorities had pointed out. So this report was released at the end of 2013, and then by then we know what happened. That Wen Jiabao had left the government. Not just that he had left the government, but he was also politically wounded. So the pressure that came from him was no longer there in the government. So this died, right? This died. But I'll tell you what I started to see the following year. In 2014, I started to see that the Chinese had basically replicated the World Bank Doing Business indicators throughout China. That they had taken the same survey instruments that they had so objected to, and they were basically rolling out the same thing. So what you started to have is essentially the same data exercise that in which each local government would be measured by sort of how well they were doing in this World Bank Doing Business, so doing business indicators. So what you see is, if you look at, and then what you start to see over time is that there started to be political pressure on these local governments to do better in these doing business indicators. So what I started to see was the rollout of simplified business regulations. So to give you one example, it is now much easier to register a business in China than it was 15 years back. Okay, there's like dramatically simplified business registration. And then after after 2014, I started seeing just lots of things that started to happen. I started to see, the creation of new, I'm just going to call it judicial and legal institutions that are focused on business and are trying to make doing business much easier. And there are two main things. One is that I saw the rollout of a new bankruptcy law and the creation of a new bankruptcy court. And essentially what this did is that, so that's not to say that there wasn't bankruptcy before in China. Obviously it was, but the way that it was done before was that this was all adjudicated, all bankruptcies were adjudicated in an ad hoc manner by local government officials. That is no longer, that became less so. So started to create new rules on how bankruptcies would be handled. And I don't need to tell you that, this is an important business institution. That is, whenever a company goes bankrupt, how are the debts and how are the accounts going to be settled? There was the creation of another court system specifically meant to adjudicate business disputes. And what I see in the data is that the adjudication time falls and all the business dispute decisions are published online. What I also started to see was the improvement in in the financial institutions. In the data, I started to see the share of credit going to smaller and medium-sized firms going up. Until 2020, there's a growing, and not just growing, but just an explosion in the number of venture capital firms and VC-funded startups. There was a creation of two new stock exchanges, the Beijing Stock Exchange and the Star Stock Exchange. That's China's attempt to replicate NASDAQ. So I would say that none of this has ever shown up in the English language media. But in terms of what I saw with my eyes, I see that they were having a real effect on the ground, right? So let me just say that it seems to be that it's a puzzle. Let me just start off with a puzzle. Under what world, how can you make sense of both of these things occurring at the same time? Okay, because both of these things are facts, right? Both of these things are facts. So, and I'll just give you one quote that at exactly, so there was, I just pulled this quote this morning a couple of weeks ago, and this is something that you hear from the Chinese premier all the time. He was giving a speech, and he constantly says that China will open its door even wider. So this is like a constant thing that he says. So the question is, what is the truth here? Okay, that is China is what is the consensus view in the U.S. right? That this era of opening up and reform is over, and China is going back to the ways of Mao? Or is China opening up, is China really about supporting the market? It's really that this path of opening up and reform is continuing, and it's expanding its doors even wider, okay? This is the contradiction that I want to try to make sense of. So what I want to try to suggest is that the way that people have been thinking about this way, which is China pro-market or is China anti-market? That is the wrong dichotomy. That's not the right way of thinking about sort of this contradiction. That it's not about, let me just use a common phrase, it's not about markets or Mao. That's the wrong trade-off. That I think the way to make sense of this, and I'll try to give you just some pieces of evidence that this is the right way to think about it, is that it's about markets and the consequences of markets versus what I'm going to call a Leninist party state. And this is the way I'm going to try to make sense of this, which is that, so the contradiction is that, both things are true, that it is now a dangerous time to be somebody like Jack Ma, and at the same time, the conditions for lots of firms are better than ever, right? And the way I think that you want to make sense of this is that it's not that the authorities dislike what the company is doing. It is that people like Jack Ma are being viewed as a threat to the control of the party, are being viewed as a threat to the control of the Leninist party. And I'll give you some pieces of evidence that what you start to see is that throughout this period, party insiders start to become, in the data, this is something that you can document, start to become increasingly so minority shareholders of some of the most important Chinese companies. And what you start to see is that more and more political decisions are driven by what I'm going to call private business interests. So the way I'm going to summarize what I think is going on is that there was this growing sense that the political power of wealthy individuals was getting larger and larger, and if this political power was not curbed, then the party is going to collapse. And that is what is behind sort of the headlines that one sees in the American media, okay? And the contradiction is that, well, this leads to also another political problem. And the political problem is that if you kill the golden goose, if you kill your most innovative companies, well, that also creates another political problem, right? And then the political problem is that, well, without a dynamic entrepreneurial private sector, the economy is also going to die. And if the economy dies, the party is also going to die, right? And that, I think, is sort of what is driving sort of the contradictions in the policies. So let me take a step back to try to give you more context on sort of why, sort of what I think has led up to this point. And the way I'm going to do this is that I'm going to bring you back to, this is about 2010, okay? And this came from a visit that I made with some collaborators of mine to this small city. It's what the Chinese call a third-tier city in southern China. We went to this city because we were trying to document what local party officials were doing with their time. Right? We sort of knew, but we wanted to collect granular data. So this came from a visit that we made. The initial person that we knew was the vice mayor of the education department in the city. And in the day that we visited him, the vice mayor had promised to meet with us, but it turned out that that day he was busy, he couldn't meet with us. So this came from the conversation we were having that morning with his chief of staff. And the chief of staff, after talking to us a little bit about what the Office of Education does, gave us this flow chart that most of you should be able to read. And he said, this summarizes what we do, right? And so for those of you who don't read Chinese, I think, do I need to go through the translation, or can everybody read this? So the point here is that if you look at what is it that this vice mayor's office was doing, okay, what they were doing with their time is that they were almost operating like a VC fund, okay? What they were doing with 100% of their time was basically soliciting business, okay? Was soliciting business, and also once the businesses had chosen to locate in the city, making sure that these businesses had everything they want in order to operate. So the way to think about that, and this is something that we documented, and not just so, and you know that this is, if you think about China in 2010 or 2011, it wasn't just a city, but it was operating throughout everywhere in China. So maybe the way to just take a step up, the way that this particular place was organized is that there was a secretary of the Communist Party, there was a mayor, and there were 9 vice mayors. And what we were able to document is that each of the vice mayors had about 20 projects, by which I mean that these are basically 20 companies. Right? There were 20 companies that they were the point person for, right? So the way the way I think about what the system was like in in this era in China, 13 years ago, 14 years ago, and everybody understood this, is that the way that you make business happen is that you find a local Communist Party official. Not just you find, but there's just also this tremendous competition that takes place. And these local party officials, once you have a deal, they use their power to help their projects. Okay, so I don't think there's any doubt that this is the system. But here's what I want you to think about, which is, and I think it's something that people didn't think about or did when this system was in full blossom. And the question is, what happens if the system really works? And what I mean really works is that if the system is so incredibly effective at building up private businesses, okay? Because this was, I'm going to call this was the golden era of China in terms of the growth of the private sector. But what happens in the future when this mechanism works so well, when one of the projects becomes $1 billion business, okay? And maybe the next thing I want to show is an example of what happens, okay? And the way I'm going to illustrate this is to talk about a story in the New York Times in October of 2012 about PingAn Insurance. This was a story that did two things to the New York Times. It won the New York Times a Pulitzer Prize, and it got the New York Times banned in China. It looks like it got it banned permanently in China. And what's the story of PingAn Insurance? It's not one of the largest companies. It's like maybe the 10th or the 15th larger company. So what the article was about is basically who are the owners of PingAn Insurance. Okay, so you can read this on the Times. But what the article was basically started by saying, documenting that the company was founded in this is very typical of large, successful Chinese private companies. It was founded by some private individuals. In this case, it was the HSBC Bank, and by a bunch of local financing vehicles, in this case from the city of Shenzhen. Okay, so that's very standard. Okay, that's completely standard. What the article was about was that at some point in time, 3% of the equity of this company was transferred to this mysterious company called Tai-Hung Holdings, right? And some of the reporters of the New York Times knew enough. Well, he won't talk about how he knew, but he will talk about how he knew. But there was something funny about Tai-Hung Holdings. So the article, most of it is about what exactly is Tai-Hung Holdings, right? So I took this from the Times. This is the picture from the Times. So what was amazing at the time was that there was a system where you could get access to the legal registration data of every single Chinese company. So all you have to do is to pay a small fee, fill out a small form, and go to the offices of the local registration department. So the person from the Times went and he got the registration documents of Tai-Hung Holdings, and what he found was that Tai-Hung Holdings has 5 owners. So think about Tai-Hung Holdings as owns 3% of this insurance company, worth maybe the company was worth about $200 billion, so Tai-Hung Holdings was worth about $6 billion, all right? So, and there are 5 owners. 2 of the owners are people, that's the thing in red, and 3 of the owners are holding shells. And I'll just say that, so I've looked at this data myself, so I now have electronic access to all of these records, and this is completely standard for the largest private companies, okay? That they're basically owned by a bunch of holding shells. And then what the guy from the Times did is that, well, most of the time, at least in the US, once a company is owned by a holding shell, there's nothing more that you can say because the holding shell is hidden behind some law firm, right? And we only know who owns the holding shells if somebody from the law firm leaks the data. That's the Panama Papers. In the case of China, however, there's a legal rule that says that the holding shells also have to be legally registered. So what he was able to do was to go through the same process and find out who owns the holding shells. Okay, so and what you find is that the holding shells are themselves owned by a bunch of holding shells, and you just keep on going. What the reporter did is that he kept on going until he finally got to the end of the road and he found who were the actual owners. And what the article was all about was that once you dig in through all these owners, what you find is that what the article was, the reason it was so politically explosive is that it was mostly, Tai Hong Holding was primarily owned by Wen Jiabao's family. Okay, not just Wen Jiabao's family, but also individuals that were connected to Wen Jiabao's family. Okay. The question then is, what are the political consequences of this? So I'm going to use this as representative of what you see. Okay. And I wanted to say that, in this case, the way you want to think about the system was that the system was such that the way that you bring a business off the ground was that you build up these alliances, and once the business becomes successful, then the ownership structure takes this form. Okay? So once this company becomes really, really successful, then that potentially poses a political problem. Okay? Now we know a little bit more because one of the people that was one of the owners of Tai Hong Holdings is this person that you may have heard of called Ms. Duan, and we all know who, and her husband published, her former husband published a book a couple of years ago, and there's this remarkable chapter in the book where the husband talks about how she, along with the husband, was able to use their political influence to push for their people to get promoted in the party hierarchy. And these people are now in jail, right? These are people in jail. But I think that this was, maybe it's not, even if it's not that common, I think it was viewed as being a real threat. That is, the people, Wen Jiabao's wife, or who I mean, even somebody not as politically connected as them, who do they owe their loyalties to? And I think that this is a big part of what is behind sort of the first thing that we see, which is what I'm going to call, which is the reaction to the political threat from the Chinese billionaires. Okay, and I'm going to call this, what we see as being the campaign to restore the control of the party. And the threat was that the influence of wealthy individuals, once these people get a lot of money, people like Ms. Duan, was so widespread that it was viewed as a threat to the party, which is, that it is potentially an independent source of political power. So I think a part of the first thing of what you see is that sometimes I call this a first strong hand, which is the view that if this is not curbed, then China is going to go the way of the Soviet Union. And so what you start to see was a crackdown on forces that pose a threat to the control of the party, which includes the large, wealthy firms. So another way of saying this is that people like Jack Ma was viewed as a threat. We can put aside, I don't know the answer to the question of whether he really was a threat. He really was a threat. He could have been totally an innocent person and the thought of ever doing something that harms the party had never crossed into his mind. That could well be the truth. And people that know him, that I've spoken to, says that no, he never posed a threat to the party. But I think, regardless of that, he was viewed as a potential threat to the party. And let me just remind you that it's not just this. It's not just that. I think a big part of what we've been seeing in the last 10 plus years is this broader campaign to avoid becoming the Soviet Union, this campaign to restore the control of the party. And that's the way I think about the anti-corruption campaign, the crackdown on celebrities, the crackdown on NGOs. We've seen, in terms of how the party operates, increased importance of loyalty in terms of promotion decisions in the party. But let me just say, if I look at the narrative, there's a lot of narrative out there, which is that no, that it's about something else, right? It's that this crackdown is about curbing monopoly power, that it's about dealing with the excesses of large firms. And let me just say that I don't think that it's really about a crackdown on large firms per se. It's not necessarily about a crackdown on wealthy individuals per se. So sometimes the way I say is that it's not as if the Chinese Communist Party is becoming like Senator Elizabeth Warren from the state of Massachusetts. And let me just give you some pieces of evidence on that there's no crackdown on state-owned monopolies. There's nothing of that. And there's also been no crackdown on the large foreign firms. So, as far as I can tell, Guo Taiming is still safe. Elon Musk is safe. And then one reason for why that could be the case is that these two people, they're not Chinese and they can never pose a political threat. Right? They're foreigners. Right? They're foreigners. So then, it's okay if these guys get wealthy because we can always control them. We can always control them politically. Okay, they don't have a big following on the Chinese social media, so they're they're fine. But then this raises the problem. The problem is that when you try to restore political control in this way, okay, that hurts your economy. And what I'm seeing in my interpretation is that the other thing that we've been seeing is the reaction to this second threat, which is we've killed off that golden goose, which we have to do if we want to survive politically, but then we have to do something else, or else our economy is going to die, right? And that, I think, is what is behind the second set of measures that I see, which is, that is, we're going to try to recover what we've lost by rolling out all these new institutions and all these new rules such that we get some growth. We get some growth, but here's the thing. We want to make sure that we get growth in a way that is not politically threatening. So if you look at the measures, these are measures that primarily benefit small and medium-sized firms, right? And the benefit of small and medium-sized firms is that they're small and medium-sized. That is, a $50 million company cannot threaten you politically in the same way that a $500 billion company can, okay? And let me just end by just saying, what do I think is the vision? So what is that? Let me just say it, the phrase, and I understand that it's a bit of a contradiction, which is the vision is to have a dynamic market economy under the control of the party. That's the vision, right? And then the question that you could ask, and we can discuss more about this, is it going to work? And I guess the answer is I don't know, right? I don't know, but I think this is what is behind sort of all the confusion that we see. It's that they're trying to get these two things, right? They're constantly trying to get these two things. So on the one hand, they crack down because of the view of the perceived political threat. Then the next day, they say, oh, no. We welcome these firms. We welcome foreign companies. We welcome the foreign investors. So this is what I predict we're going to see in the near future. That there's going to be this constant policy reversals that is coming about because they're trying to hit these two objectives at the same time. Okay, so let me just end here, and then I can talk more about anything you want to talk about.